November 1st, 1971. Hong Kong. 8:43 in the evening. The line outside the theater on Nathan Road stretched back further than anyone had expected. Not dozens of people, hundreds. The queue had formed before 6 o'clock, before the sun had finished going down, and by the time the evening had settled into the specific warm darkness of a Hong Kong November, still humid, still carrying the harbor smell of salt and diesel and something organic from the fish markets further south, it had wrapped around the corner and continued for a distance that the theater manager, by several accounts, walked 3 times just to convince himself he was seeing it correctly. The film opening that night was The Big Boss. It had been shot earlier that year, March through May in Pak Chong, Thailand, in heat that the crew had not fully prepared for, followed by studio work back in Hong Kong. The production had been, by the standards of what Hong Kong cinema was doing in 1971, a serious undertaking. Golden Harvest Studios, which had only recently broken from the Shaw Brothers system to operate independently, had committed real resources to it. The expectations were reasonable. The hope was that it would perform. What was happening outside the theater on Nathan Road was not reasonable. It was not performing. It was something else entirely, something that required a different vocabulary, and that the people responsible for the film would spend the next several days trying to find the right words to describe. Bruce Lee was 30 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. He arrived at the theater at 8:43 in the evening, and the man at the side entrance did not know who he was. Let me build this scene properly, because the details matter more than they might seem to at first. The side entrance to the theater was a narrow door off an alley that ran alongside the building, the kind of access point that exists at every theater for the people who are supposed to come and go without using the main entrance. It was managed that evening by a security employee who had been given a list. The list had names on it. He had been told to check names against the list and admit the people on it. He had been doing this job since 7 o'clock. He was, by all accounts, doing it correctly. Bruce Lee was not on the list. This requires a moment of explanation. Hong Kong in November 1971 was not yet a city that recognized Bruce Lee's face on the street. He had been away, years in America, working in television, building something in a market that had not yet sent its results back across the Pacific. The Green Hornet had not aired in Hong Kong. His guest appearances on American series were unknown here. He was, to the man at the side entrance with the list, a person who had arrived at a door he should have a name on a list to use and whose name was not there. The man told him the entrance was for authorized personnel. Bruce Lee looked at the door for a moment. "I'm in the film," he said. The man looked at him. 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds, a collared shirt, no entourage, no car waiting behind him in the alley, no visible evidence of anyone important. "Name?" the man said. Here is where I want to stop for a moment, because when I first came across this account, pieced together from 2 or 3 sources that agree on the broad facts while differing on some of the details, I had a reaction that I did not immediately understand. It took me a while to figure out what it was. It was not amusement, though there is something almost perfectly constructed about the situation if you approach it from a certain angle. A man denied entry to his own film premiere. The specific comedy of that. It was not outrage exactly, though outrage would have been a reasonable response. A man who had spent months in Thai heat making a film being told by a man with a clipboard that he did not have authorization to enter the building where that film was about to be shown. What I felt, sitting with this story, was something closer to recognition, because what was happening at that side door was a compressed version of something much larger, the same logic, operating at the same speed, in a much smaller frame. The system that was managing the door did not know who he was. The system that was managing Hollywood did not know who he was. Both systems were operating correctly by their own internal rules. Both systems were, in this particular moment, in contact with a reality they had not yet updated themselves to include. He was standing at the door. The film that bore his name was inside. To understand the full weight of that moment, you need to understand what Hong Kong cinema was in 1971 and what it had been and what it was about to become. The early 1970s were a period of real upheaval in the Hong Kong film industry. For years, the Shaw Brothers studio had operated essentially as a monopoly, controlling production, distribution, the theaters themselves, the careers of the actors and directors who worked within its system. Shaw Brothers was not a bad studio in the straightforward sense. It made films that audiences watched. But it was a closed system, and closed systems are, by their nature, resistant to the kind of new thing that changes everything. Golden Harvest had broken from that system only recently, in the late 1960s, and was still establishing itself as a viable alternative, still proving that films could be made and distributed outside the existing structure. It had the hunger of an institution that had something to prove. It had the infrastructure, just barely, to back that hunger up. Bruce Lee arrived at the precise moment when Hong Kong cinema had a place for him that had not previously existed, when the commercial and creative conditions were right for exactly what he was bringing. He could not have come 5 years earlier and found the same opening. He did not come 5 years later. The timing, which felt at the time like luck or accident, looks from this distance like something else, like a convergence that was waiting for both things to arrive. That was what was inside the theater, and the man with the list did not know it yet. What happened next depends on which account you follow, and here I want to be straight with you about the limits of the record. The versions agree on the essential fact. Bruce Lee was initially turned away, or nearly turned away, at the side entrance. They agree that someone intervened, a production associate, a Golden Harvest employee, someone who was moving between the main entrance and the back of house and happened to come through the alley at the right moment. They agree that the situation was resolved. They differ on how long it took, on whether Bruce Lee said anything further to the man at the door, on whether there was a specific exchange of words between the intervening party and the security employee. One account suggests the whole thing lasted under 2 minutes. Another implies it stretched longer with more back and forth before the right person appeared. I cannot tell you with certainty which version is accurate. What I can tell you is that by 9 o'clock, Bruce Lee was inside the building. What happened after that is not in dispute at all. The Big Boss ran for approximately 100 minutes. The audience at the premiere on November 1st, 1971, not a general public audience but an industry audience, critics, distributors, people whose professional judgment constituted the first real test of what the film was, watched it in a way that the people present that night described consistently across many different accounts. The word used most often, looking back at the recollections from this evening, is the word silence. Not the silence of a disengaged audience, but the specific, focused silence of a room that is paying very close attention because something on the screen has its full attention. And then the scenes where Bruce Lee fought. The accounts from people who were in the industry in Hong Kong in 1971 describe a particular problem that the action choreography in The Big Boss created for anyone watching it. It moved at a speed that the audience's eyes were not accustomed to in action cinema. Not the artificial speed of editing. Cuts that imply speed without showing it. Actual human movement at an actual human speed that happened to be categorically faster than what audiences had been watching men do on screen. This created a specific experience that several accounts describe in the same way. The audience did not know whether to trust what they were seeing. The movement was too fast. The distance between what was possible and what was on screen was too small. People leaned forward. People looked at each other during the fights. making the involuntary checking motion of a person who wants to confirm that someone else is also seeing what they are seeing. They were seeing it. Bruce Lee was somewhere in the theater during this, not in an obvious place. The accounts do not describe him in a position of prominence, watching the audience watch him. He was simply present, the way a person is present at an event that belongs to them, but has also grown past the point where they control it entirely. There is something I keep returning to about this particular evening. I keep returning to it, and I am still not entirely certain what it means, so I am going to share it and let you sit with it the same way I have been sitting with it. The man at the door with the list had not been wrong exactly. He had been operating with the information he had. His information was, this is a man without a name on this list. His conclusion was, this man does not have authorization to enter. That conclusion was completely logical given the information. The only thing wrong with it was that the information was incomplete. The world had changed, or was in the process of changing in the next several hours, and the man with the list did not yet know about the change. This is something I want to ask you to think about alongside me, because I think it matters beyond this specific story. There are two ways to read the man with the list. One reading is that he was the face of a system that didn't know what it was looking at, a small local instance of the same failure of recognition that had been operating in Hollywood for years. The other reading is that he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, and the failure was structural rather than personal. The information he had been given was simply not current with reality. I go back and forth between those readings. I am genuinely not sure which one lands as true, or if the distinction between them matters as much as it first seems to. If you have a view on this, I want to know. Leave it in the comments. I mean that. This is one of those questions that has stayed with me longer than I expected. The Big Boss was released to the general public on October 31st, 1971, one day before this premiere. Within weeks, the box office numbers it was producing had begun to do something that box office numbers, when they are large enough and clear enough, always do. They forced a recalculation. The records the film broke in Hong Kong were not marginal. They were not the kind of improvement on expectation that the industry absorbs and continues. They were the kind of numbers that require the people responsible for those numbers to go back to the beginning of the conversation and start it again. He had practiced his craft for years, not 10,000 different things, the same things over and over, until the things were his, until they could not be separated from the person performing them. The speed that the audience at the premiere had leaned forward to confirm they were really seeing was not a gift or an accident. It was the product of repetition so total and so committed that it had become indistinguishable from the person himself. The man with the list had seen a man in a collared shirt who was not on his list. What he had actually been looking at was the thing that would break the box office records. These were the same thing. He had no way to know that yet. Fist of Fury went into production within months, approximately October through December of 1971, at Golden Harvest Studios in Kowloon. The same concrete block construction, the same crowded sound stages, the Cantonese and English mixing mid-sentence between takes, the studio lighting creating its own specific heat above the 35-degree ambient temperature of a Hong Kong production building, the harbor smell coming in when anyone opened an exterior door, the dim sum carts at midday. A production moving with the speed of an industry that now understood something it had not understood in March. By the time Fist of Fury was released, March 22, 1972, the conversation had shifted. Not shifted slightly. Shifted in the fundamental way that conversations shift when the numbers make the old assumptions impossible to continue holding. The man who had arrived at a side door in an alley in November 1971 without his name on a list was, by early 1972, the most commercially significant actor in Hong Kong cinema. He was the same person. The list had simply been updated. Way of the Dragon shot in August and September of 1972. Rome first, the Colosseum area in the early morning, the stone pale gold in the hours before the tourists arrived, the dry Mediterranean heat so different from Hong Kong that the crew spent the first 2 days simply adjusting to the texture of the air. The Italian motor scooters between takes, the espresso cart making its twice-daily circuit, 3 languages operating simultaneously on a set where he was no longer just the actor, he was the writer, the director, the person every significant creative decision passed through. He had not waited to be put on a list. He had written the list himself. He had built the thing that the list authorized entry to. He had done this not through a sudden turn of fortune, but through the specific, patient, relentless application of something he had understood about creation for years, that the limits you accept become the limits you inhabit, and that the limits you refuse to accept have a way, slowly, of ceasing to exist. The door had turned him away. He went in anyway. And then he went back to Hong Kong and built something that meant he would never stand in an alley without his name on a list again. There is a postscript to this story that I did not know how to place until the very end. The man at the side entrance, the one with the list, the one who had done his job correctly and told a man whose name was not on the list that he could not enter, did not recognize Bruce Lee because Bruce Lee had not yet become the person whose face you recognize. He was in the process of becoming that person. The becoming was happening that night, inside the building, in the silence of an industry audience watching something move across a screen at a speed they could not quite believe. The becoming was happening in the alley too, in the brief exchange between a man with a clipboard and a man in a collared shirt who said simply, "I'm in the film." The key to being remembered, the thing that makes a life worth the telling, is not arriving at the door when the list already has your name. It is what you build in the time before that, when the systems that manage the lists have not yet caught up to what you are. He had been building it for years. The premiere was not the beginning of that. The premiere was just the night the numbers started confirming what the building had already made true. The list caught up eventually. Everything else was already done.